Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Federal Highway Administration Safe Pedestrian Crossings at Transit webinar. Today, our presenters are going to discuss how transit agencies and local governments are working together to ensure pedestrians can travel to and from stops and stations safely when they need to cross the street. This webinar is part of a series of webinars focusing on pedestrian safety by FHWA's STEP program, which stands for Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian. My name is Rachel Byerly, and I'm Communications Director with the National Aging and Disabilities Transportation Center. We're hosting today's webinar in conjunction with FHWA. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Ken Thompson, who's an NADTC Technical Assistance Specialist, and he'll talk and review the housekeeping items before our webinar.
Hi, everyone. We have a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. This session is being recorded and will be available as an archive on the NADTC website. Closed captioning is available for today's session, and you can access captioning by clicking on the CC icon at the top left of your Blackboard screen or by using the keyboard command +F8. We'd like to thank our captioner for being with us today. If you're connecting today by phone and the webinar room, please ensure your computer speakers are muted at this time to eliminate any potential feedback. To submit questions, which can be done at the end of the session today, you can either enter your question into the chat box if you're in the webinar room, or you can email your question to contact@nadtc.org. A quick reminder is that the chat section is public. We'll address as many questions at the end of the webinar as it is possible. Oh yes, webinar instructions. If you're having technical difficulties connecting to the webinar or hearing, contact us at the email address contact@nadtc.org. And so as I said, you may submit your questions throughout the session today. All right, and we're going to do a quick poll during this session. And when you're going to be clicking on the letter A, B, or C to tell us how many people are viewing at this time. So if you look at that little letter A on the left-hand side, if you click the letter A, it's 1 to 3 people. The letter B, 4 to 6 people. And the letter C, 7 or more people. Give you a chance to vote. So if you looked at the letter, look at that on the left side, look at the letter A again. I'd like to get a few more votes coming in. Click on A, B, or C. A few more in. Okay, let's look at that. There are coming some more votes. And it does look like the highest number is the letter A, 1 to 3. And a few more coming in. We think we're good on the poll. Okay, letter A. So 1 to 3, the number of singles or a few other people are viewing today.
All right. Thank you so much, Ken. And in addition to myself, also on the webinar today are Carol Cachadorian from Tool Design Group, and we also want to recognize Becky Crow from FHWA. Becky is here to provide the official welcome. Thank you, Becky.
Well, thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I manage the STEP program at Federal Highway Administration. And on behalf of Federal Highway, I want to thank everyone for participating in the webinar. But I'd especially like to thank Ken and Rachel and the National Center for partnering with us to provide information on STEP. We hope you enjoy the webinar. And please don't hesitate to contact Federal Highway if you have any questions after the webinar is over about STEP. Thanks, Rachel.
You're welcome. And before we launch into talking about the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center, I just want to mention the purpose of today's webinar is to share information on safe crossings, and we're also going to be discussing countermeasures that can be used for transit access. We're going to focus on uncontrolled crossings and also the transit agency experience regarding STEP countermeasures. And we'll be sharing information about how you can find out more about the STEP program. And as we mentioned, we'll have a question and answer period at the end of the webinar where you'll have the opportunity to use the chat box or email to post your questions to us. All right, and with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started to provide an overview about what we do at the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center. A little bit about the NADTC. We are a technical assistance center, and we're funded by the Federal Transit Administration. We're co-administered by Easter Seals and the National Association of Area Agencies on Aging. The center was established in 2015, so we've been active for 3 years now. We offer training, resources, and publications. We have a toll-free hotline and information and referral. Our primary audience at NADTC includes older adults, people with disabilities, caregivers, and professionals such as yourself who serve older adults and people with disabilities. Particular focus areas for us include public and private transportation, ADA accessibility, community livability, pedestrian safety, travel training, and driver transition. You can find a variety of resources on the NADTC website, which is www.nadtc.org, and we have a number of pedestrian topics. If you go to the website, in the search box you can type in pedestrian, and the type of things that will come up will be our guide on accessible pathways. We have a number of walkability, audits, and transit assessments, a driver and pedestrian guide. We also have archived Twitter chats that we've done in the past, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in my presentation. And we also have a guide on snow removal and wayfinding. So when we start to discuss pedestrian accessibility at crossings and transit stops, what are the type of elements we're going to mention today? First and foremost, from an accessibility perspective, with new projects and reconstruction, if you're installing features such as sidewalks, curb ramps, detectable warning surfaces, signals, and markings, these must meet ADA requirements. The type of treatments that you may use include visible and audible pedestrian signals, mid-block crossing treatments, pedestrian refuge islands, burial removal, and other means to raise driver awareness. And our presenters are going to go into more detail about those particular treatments. And while the ADA itself may not require these particular features, if you install them, what you install must be ADA accessible. And another thing I do want to mention as we're talking about physical infrastructure is that we want to think not only of pedestrian facilities that serve those with physical disabilities, but also those who may have cognitive disabilities or perhaps have a condition such as dementia. Using the photo in the slide as a particular example, you notice it's a distinctive glass building with some color on it. And structures such as this, colors, sculptures, fountains, those are all landmarks or wayfinding elements that can be used to help serve as prompts in the pedestrian environment for those who have cognitive disabilities. All right. When we talk about accessibility, we also want to mention that it goes beyond just the physical infrastructure itself. Pedestrian accessibility decisions, as we know, are typically local in nature, and they need to include an inclusive community input from older adults, students, and people with disabilities. Those who regularly use your walking route should be at the table along with the other transportation modes during the public engagement process. Walking assessments and audits are common ways to receive feedback on plans. The photo in this particular slide shows a transit stop and a bike rack surrounded by snow. Another thing that we try to emphasize is that when you're doing assessments and audits, take weather consideration and the conditions for your part of the country into consideration as part of your audit and assessment. It's not just a summertime activity, but it's a year-round activity. So accessibility refers to the entire process that's being used to plan, design, and build physical facilities, not just the ADA features of the facilities themselves. Accessibility decisions may be local, but the conversation is definitely national in scale. The NADTC, along with other partners such as America Walks and the Safe Route Partnership, periodically hosts Twitter chats on walking. We hosted a Safe Walking Twitter chat last year, and there are some example graphics that we use to help market that Twitter chat shown on your screen. And we recently co-hosted the February 20th #SafeWalks Twitter chat with America Walks and other national organizations. If you have not participated in one of these Twitter chats, we recommend getting involved. These are 1-hour-long online discussions, and it's a great way to find out about national initiatives, meet your peers in the field, and receive downloadable resources like infographics or links to publications. You can go to Twitter and search by #SafeWalks, or you can visit the NADTC website and you'll find an archive of this most recent chat. And before we move into the STEP program presentation and hear from our local transportation systems, which we're all looking forward to, I'd like to just leave you with a quote that is from an FTA manual. And that is, transit users are pedestrians, either on foot or via wheelchair or other assistive device on at least one end of their journey. In short, you can't get there if you can't get there. And that's the reason why we're all here and why access to transit should be both safe and accessible. That's an introduction of what we do at the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center, and we're now going to jump into more detail about STEP and our local examples. Joining us today is Carol Cachadorian from Tool Design Group, and Carol will provide a brief overview of STEP and the 5 or 6 countermeasures that form the core of the program. Carol is also going to introduce our guest speakers along with Ken Thompson, and so Carol, I'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and I'm pleased to be here and see that we have so many folks joining us for this webinar. I want to start with a question about why pedestrian safety is so important. It is because pedestrians are perhaps the most vulnerable road users based on how much they weigh and the exposure that they have when they are particularly crossing the street. This vulnerability increases exponentially with vehicular speeds, and that's why slowing speeds at locations where pedestrians cross is so important. As this graph shows, there has been a steady climb in pedestrian fatalities for the past few years, and that's why FHWA has made it a priority through the STEP program. Next slide, please. So this says that 72% of pedestrian fatalities occur at non-intersection locations. Typically, this is along transit routes. That means they're at mid-block or uncontrolled locations where there are companion bus stops that a transit user is walking to or from at one end of their trip. And so the STEP program in FHWA is working specifically at non-intersection locations and along transit routes. Next slide, please. And that's why this webinar focuses on transit service. These are some examples of bus stop placement that puts pedestrians using the bus at risk. And so let's go to the next slide and briefly talk about some of the countermeasures. These are called the Fabulous 5: crosswalk visibility enhancements, raised crosswalk, pedestrian refuge island, pedestrian hybrid beacon, road diet, and note that there is a 6th one that is a rectangular rapid flash beacon, which is making a reappearance. Next slide, please. I'd like to orient you first to the graphic that you'll see here, and this is on the technical sheets available on the STEP website. These are conceptual graphics, and they are really meant to help visualize, but they're not design level, so I want to make that clear. The call-outs that you see for the signage are referenced in the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, the MUTCD. And so when you're using these to get a sense of what you want to do at an uncontrolled crossing, consult the MUTCD as well as any local design guidance or standards. The blue text shows has a percentage for crash reduction factors, and that is the percent reduction that might be expected after implementing a given countermeasure at a specific site. For example, installing a centerline rumble strip on a two-lane roadway can reduce crashes by 14% and 55% crash reduction specifically for head-on crashes. So that's how those crash reduction factors work. For this countermeasure, this one is on crosswalk visibility enhancements, and this one shows a high visibility crosswalk. In other words, the striping is very visible to both pedestrians and motorists and bicyclists, and it's combined with a curb extension. That curb extension brings the curb into the roadway, and it shortens the crossing distance. It also restricts parking, or if we can say it more positively, it establishes limits on curbside parking to ensure pedestrians are visible to motorists when traveling in the crosswalk. So that's the first countermeasure. Let's go to the next slide, please. The next one is a raised crosswalk, and you'll see that this has a crash reduction factor of 45%, a pretty strong measure. This shows the same effective distance as a curb extension, but again, that raised crosswalk makes pedestrians more visible. The raised crosswalk has the high visibility striping. Let's go to the next slide, please. The next countermeasure is a refuge island. So as you can see a theme here, we are shortening crossing distances and we're making pedestrians more visible. Another way to shorten crossing distances is to put in a refuge island, also called a center median. And what it does is it reduces the number of lanes that a pedestrian crosses at any given time. That allows the pedestrian to cross one lane, in this example, go to the center and check before crossing another lane. This reduces pedestrian crashes by about 32%. Next slide, please. This is our friend, the Hawk signal, formerly called the pedestrian hybrid beacon. And the crash reduction factor here is 55%. I suspect that many of you have recommended the Hawk or have used a Hawk. It does require motorists to stop when the lights are flashing. There is typically instructions for the motorists to know when, because sometimes the light flashes red and sometimes it's a constant red. So the instructions that are visible to the motorists need to be simple, clear, and easy to understand. And this countermeasure uses an advanced stop bar where the motorists need to stop behind in order to make sure pedestrians are visible and have a clear pathway to cross. Let's go to the next slide, please. This last one is a road diet. And it's a change in the roadway that reduces the number of motor vehicle travel lanes, but in most cases it adds 2 bike lanes. Now, based on the evaluation of many road diets across the country, we know that all types of crashes go down with road diets. Average travel speeds go down, particularly for motorists, but their travel time along the corridor tends to remain constant. And motorists tend to continue to travel on road-dieted streets, not going through nearby neighborhoods. Pedestrian crashes tend to go down as well, as do bicycle crashes. Now, one thing I want to point out in these examples, this has a crash reduction factor of between 19 and 47%. So they are very effective. One thing I want to point out in this example is, and it's been in the other examples, is lighting. You'll see that this light is placed before the crosswalk by about 10 feet. It is not directly over the crosswalk or after it, because that tends to make pedestrians using that crosswalk during low light times as less visible to approaching motorists. So those are the 5 countermeasures. Next slide, please. I'd like to also share with you a new guide that FHWA published in January. It's a guide for improving pedestrian safety at uncontrolled locations. It's based on a 6-step process that will help you determine which of these countermeasures or elements of them can be used at a particular crossing location. It's especially useful to help you when you're working with local and state transportation staff. And one of the benefits of having presentations from these 3 transit agencies is you're going to hear exactly how they do that. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So importantly, there are 3 things to think about when you're working with your transportation agency. Is the street a locally owned road or a state-owned road? So you want to make sure that you're contacting the right person, whether it's a safety engineer or a pedestrian coordinator. You also want to take a look at the crash history. You want to research crash data and maps, probably try to map those crashes, and if you see that they are along a particular corridor where there are transit stops, take a look to see if they're at formal pedestrian crossings or ones that are uncontrolled. And then you'll want to create a plan or conduct a field review, and there are different ways to do that with walk audits and road safety audits and access to transit plans. Next slide, please. This is one guide that FHWA has, but there are other resources. Here are 4 that are specifically related to pedestrian safety, and 3 of them are for transit service specifically. So go to the FHWA website and you can find these resources. Next slide, please. Again, I want to give you the contact information for the folks that manage the STEP program, Becky Crow and Peter Unn. You will have these slides if you don't have them already with links and all of the resources, so please keep this in mind. Now I want to introduce today's presenters. Next slide, please. We're really getting to the heart of this webinar. We are fortunate to have 3 transit agencies represented. From Valley Metro in Phoenix, we have Sarath Joshua and Jay Yanerick. They are going to be talking about the light rail system in Phoenix. From Metro Bus in Washington, D.C., we have Aaron Overman, who will talk about safe pedestrian access at bus stops. And from GRTC in Richmond, Virginia, we have Ashley Mason talking about a very exciting project in Richmond, their new BRT service called Pulse. So with that, I'll turn things over to Sarath and Jay. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting us to present on how the Phoenix Metro region is addressing safe pedestrian access to transit. This is not an easy topic to present given the recent statistics on pedestrian deaths in our metro region and also the state. Last month, the Governor's Highway Safety Association reported that Arizona has the highest rate of pedestrian deaths in the nation at 1.61 deaths per 100,000 people, about double the national average of 0.81. So let me say up front that we do have a lot of challenges to overcome in making our roads safe for pedestrians. We are fully aware of this problem and are working on several fronts. My co-presenter Jay and I will share information on what has been done to address this problem. Next slide. I'd like to start by pointing out some characteristics of our region that creates elevated road risk for pedestrians. We have a relatively new freeway system that is very efficient at moving vehicles very fast. I mention this to highlight the fact that speeding is common out here and it goes well beyond the freeway system. We have an arterial road system with a mile square grid system with straight roads. It is very rare to find curved roads here. As you all know, straight roads are great for speeding. We also have wide arterials with lots of capacity for moving vehicles fast, which makes unprotected street crossing quite risky. For most of the year, we have perfect weather for walking or biking, except for the months June through July, when peak temperatures reach about 110 to 115 Fahrenheit. The chart at the bottom right shows the pedestrian crash totals for the 5 years ending in 2016. You can see the drop in the summer months mainly due to reduced walking and pedestrian exposure. The chart at the bottom left shows pedestrian crash trend for this same period. The red line represents all fatal and injury crashes. That's about 60 to 70%. This number is higher for mid-block crashes at 70 to 80% of all crashes end up as fatal or injuries. So who are the pedestrians in our region? All transit riders, students walking to nearby schools, visitors, tourists, folks walking by choice, and folks who have no other choice to get from point A to point B. Next slide. The Phoenix metro region is fast becoming the second home for Hawk pedestrian signals, next to Tucson, Arizona, where the idea of the Hawk signal originated. This is a homegrown solution for pedestrian safety problem. There are about 50 Hawk signals currently installed, and more are planned across the region. They provide mid-block access to transit stops and other destinations as shown here in these two slides here, pictures here. Many local communities are now requesting local agencies to install Hawks so that their residents can have safe access to transit and other destinations. For many years, traffic engineering practices both here in Arizona and elsewhere were mostly focused on moving vehicles. Signalized pedestrian crossings were often considered too costly and hindrance to traffic flow. This is fast changing across the nation, and Hawks may have helped in this direction. However, I'd like to note that the critical link between transit and safe pedestrian access is still not fully addressed. Next slide. Road diets are another solution for making roads safer for pedestrians, giving the drivers a clear message on the need to accommodate other road users. These are some examples of recent projects showing the application of road diets. Many of these pictures that I have included in this presentation show pedestrian safety improvements, but not all of them show a clear link to the transit access. The point I'd like to make is that these improvements are also being made near transit stops. Next slide. This is another example of a road diet in Phoenix converting a 4-lane road with no median to a 2-lane road with a center, a 2-way left turn lane, and bicycle lanes. Road diets like this have resulted in lowering vehicle speeds and reducing the risk to pedestrians who wish to cross. Next slide. This is an example for improving crosswalk visibility through lighting. This lighted crosswalk example comes from my hometown of Chandler, Arizona. Several lighted mid-block crossings are located in the downtown area with heavy pedestrian traffic and posted speed limit of 30 miles per hour. Upon pedestrian push button activation, the LED lights on the crosswalk start flashing, along with the rectangular rapid flashing beacons facing either approach, alerting drivers. This is another improvement that has seen a lot of good driver response. Next slide. A number of local agencies have implemented rectangular rapid flashing beacons at mid-block crossings and have reported positive results regarding improved driver response. Again, many of these crosswalks are in close proximity to transit stops or other pedestrian destinations. The recent, allowing RRFBs were stopped for a little while by federal highways, but we understand that they are again allowed to use due to the rolling back of the patent on that. So agencies are free to use them now. Next slide. This is an example for a location where pedestrian scramble has been implemented at a T intersection with lots of pedestrian traffic, mainly Arizona State University students. Traffic is stopped on all approaches to allow pedestrians to cross on all legs of the intersection at the same time, rather than wait for a particular signal phase. My apologies, as this picture does not properly depict the pedestrian scramble, because timing was not right for the picture. Next slide. Since 2011, we have been performing urban road safety assessments at intersections with locations where there's a record of high crash occurrence. A few years ago, we received a request from our regional transit agency, WMATA, to conduct a transit RSA near a light rail station. Since then, we have conducted RSAs at 8 such locations, generating a number of recommendations for safety improvements. Transit RSA recommendations are passed along both to transit agency, WMATA, and to the local city. The common observation was that long pedestrian wait times at the signals, which resulted in a recommendation to increase the walk times. Pedestrian countdown timers and audible pedestrian buttons were also some of the recommendations. The pictures on this slide were taken by RSA team members to illustrate the general disregard for signals at particular locations with heavy ASU student traffic. The sequence of pictures at the bottom shows students skateboarding right under the gate of an LRT crossing. Risky behavior among youth is a common observation. However, I must note that the increasing trend of pedestrian deaths and injuries in our region cannot be attributed to risky behavior of the general population. Next slide. Here are two more observations of likely LRT riders crossing at unexpected locations. The RFBs have recommended educational programs to increase awareness among transit users on the risk of such crossings. These observations may also point out the need for better design in the future to accommodate desired movements by pedestrians. Next slide. This map shows our wonderful mile grid network of arterial streets on which we have plotted the locations in red where the pedestrians were killed or seriously injured during the 5-year period that ended in 2016, along with bus stop locations shown as tiny green dots. We are in the midst of a study exploring the possible links between pedestrian crashes and proximity to bus stops. The study goal is to identify candidate mid-block locations for pedestrian crossing improvements. As a result of this investigation, we have so far identified 18 candidate sites based on the density of fatal or serious injury crashes and bus stop density along transit routes. The current condition at each of these locations are either marked or unmarked crossings, or a marked crossing with a pedestrian refuge. We are currently developing a regional safety project application to compete for federal HSIP funds in fiscal year 21 and 22 for installing hawk signals at each of these locations. That concludes my part of the presentation, and my colleague Jay Yanarick will continue from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Joshua. Dr. Joshua showed you a couple pictures of our light rail system. Our light rail system has over 150 intersections, or over 200 intersections now. We're about 26 miles long, and so we've really grown since 2008, and we've just continue to have unique situations where we need to have pedestrians cross our line. For the most part, our intersections is where we do the crossing. So we have traditional signalized intersections, and then we have pedestrian only. We do that downtown for high pedestrian areas like at ASU, like Dr. Joshua was talking about. Next slide. We also do unsignalized crossings. We try to do this in only locations where our operators can go at very low speeds. They're very aware of their surroundings. You can see the 10 on the screen there. They are only allowed to go 10 miles an hour as they leave this platform. So the danger to them is very minimal at this location. Next slide. Also, we are the transit agency, and we control the vehicle. This is probably one of the most unique features of our system. This bumper that you see right there it moves pedestrians out of the way when they are in conflict with us. We have not had that. We haven't had any head-on fatalities with pedestrians on our light rail system. We have had it in other places on the bus system, but not with the light rail because of this bumper. This bumper is also good with vehicles, regular vehicles, but it also does well with pedestrians. So I encourage any transit agency that's out there to look into that. So of course we always have special events in downtown Phoenix. We use police and we try to channelize the best we can. Can you go to the next slide? So this was Super Bowl 49. It was very crazy. So what we did there, we had to use channelization and barriers. We also used police. We also used all the staff that we had available. I actually worked that platform one night to help control the traffic, the amount of pedestrians that we had. It was a unique experience. Next. Next I want to talk about is a roundabout that we're planning. It's actually under construction right now. We've designed it, and it is fairly unique in that we're going to have an unsignalized crossing. So one of the things that we did, you can look in the upper left-hand corner. Our attempt was to slow the vehicles coming into the roundabout and into the area where the pedestrian would first cross. Next slide, please. So what we're going to use is a Z crossing. You can find a standard Z crossing in UTCD. One of the things that we're going to do, though, is put in-ground flashers for the pedestrians. So when the train is coming, because most people are looking down these days, they're all on their iPhones, they're all on their devices looking down. They're not really paying attention. So our goal is to make the pedestrians aware of when a train is coming, so they'll be actually flashing at them from the ground level. Additionally, we have other mitigations in place in case that we need to go to full gates there. We're putting in extra conduits and extra gates, or well, we have the potential to put in gates should we need that. And so we look forward to seeing what happens with this intersection once it gets activated. And with that, I thank you all.
Thank you, Sarah and Jay. We're going to move on to our next speaker. It's Aaron Overman from the Washington Metropolitan Transit Authority. And so, Aaron, go ahead.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Aaron Overman. I'm the Senior Planner in charge of Customer Facilities for WMATA. It's also known as Metro here in D.C. Today I'm going to be presenting an overview of Metro's role in bus stop coordination throughout our region's service area and presenting a case study of a project where Metro worked with one of our jurisdictional partners on some larger scale capital improvements to improve bus stop and pedestrian safety. Oops, looks like, sorry. One more time. Next slide, please. Great. So Metro operates in a huge service area. We have about 4 million people, 1,500 square miles, 9 separate political jurisdictions, 2 states, and the District of Columbia. So throughout this area, everywhere that Metro bus serves, Metro is responsible for determining where the bus stops go and for coordinating with the jurisdictional right-of-way owners on bus stop amenities and safety. We also work with jurisdictions planning major capital projects, and we leverage them as opportunities to improve the bus stops in the corridors, and we do the same with developers adjacent to our bus stops. Anytime that a developer applies for a public space permit, we work with the developer through the jurisdiction to make sure that the bus stop adjacent to their development is upgraded as much as we can make it. Next slide. So the scope of our accessibility and safety challenge is enormous. Out of about 11,000 bus stops that we have in our service area, more than half of them do not meet ADA compliance. And nearly all of them are on rights-of-way that Metro doesn't own or control. So at each one of the bus stops, what we own is the pole, the flag. You can see that in the picture there with one of our jurisdictional partners' flags on there alongside ours, and the information attached to the pole like a schedule or a route map. We did receive a federal grant several years ago to improve ADA access at a bunch of stops, but coordinating construction on facilities that are not owned by us has been a really difficult issue, and we've had a lot of challenges with working with right-of-way owners. So we really depend on the right-of-way owners to construct the improvements and comply with ADA in almost every case. Estimates that we've collected show that it would take nearly $100 million to improve all of the stops in the region to our standards and make them compliant with ADA. So we've done a lot of work. Montgomery County, which is a local county, has done about $25 million worth of work just in their own county alone. So we're continuing to work at it, but the problem is still large. Next slide. So a little bit about our guidelines. The ADA has certain requirements, which many of you are probably familiar with, but we also realized that in order to serve our customers properly, that Metro needed to go further than the ADA does. In 2014, we added a policy statement criteria about bus stops, and it requires that not only is there a sort of level landing pad and infrastructure at the stop, but that there's a curb cut nearby the stop with a receiving curb cut at a crossing. So in order for us to consider the stop accessible for our own purposes, we do require that there have to be those curb cuts and crossings. The cover that you see there, the designing placement of transit stops, you can Google that document and pull that up. It's got a lot of really good information in there about not just the ADA, but kind of bus stops in general and how we want them to be designed ideally. Next slide. So every year we get dozens of roadway corridor plans, big sets of plans that are sent to our office that describe plans where the right-of-way, improvements to the right-of-way where our buses operate. We've done a pretty good job of ensuring that our jurisdictional leads and our designers understand the needs of bus stops and bus operations and bus customers, but we often have to do a fair amount of hand-holding to get the plans to a workable place. So it's a combination of, looking at things and reviewing, but we'd like to educate people ahead of time as much as we can so that the plans that we see coming in the door are acceptable as much as we can. Several years ago, we did decide as Metro that no new bus stops were going to be added to the system if they weren't compliant with ADA and our standards. So that's a way for us to sort of hold the line on incompliant and unacceptable bus stop plans and roadway construction that doesn't meet the needs of our customers and pedestrians getting on and off the bus. Particularly in DC, the District of Columbia, the local governments have been extremely supportive of our working with developers to improve access and amenities at bus stops adjacent to new buildings and properties. So if any place that's an available option, I encourage everybody to take advantage of that through your jurisdiction. Developers are coming in and they want the roadside, the curbside to look nice. They want there to be good access to their new development. So if there's a way to sort of leverage that review process, we've had a lot of success with that. Next slide. All right, so our case study that I'd like to talk about really is an example of a lot of things you've seen already that Carol went over and the folks from Phoenix went over. The roadway corridor is called Ager Road. It's 1.28 miles long. It's a $12 million project. So this is really finding ways to get access to these bus stops without doing major construction is very difficult. A lot of times the problems in the roadway are too deep, too much to kind of do spot improvements. You really have to look at it from a corridor perspective. So this corridor is in suburban Washington. It's in Prince George's County, Maryland. To the right of the slide where you see there's like a little loop that comes down from the green roadway. That's our West Hyattsville Green Line stop. So there's a major transit location there, a rail station as well as a bus station, and the buses run along Ager Road. The project purpose is to essentially do two travel lanes in each direction, bicycle lanes in each direction, some parallel parking, give sidewalks where they're not existing today, some buffers. There's a lot of stormwater work associated with this project. You can see there's a stream that runs right through the middle of it, so stormwater management is a major part of this project. And as far as transit, giving spaces for buses to stay in the roadway, places for customers to board and get off buses, and we have worked very closely with the county on the whole project. So if we could look at the next slide, we can get into a little bit more details on it. So one of the things that we looked at in this study, or this project, was stop consolidation. There are a few stops that were either not very well used or that were in locations that were hard to design them safely. So we did look at a couple stops in the corridor and just taking them out completely and focusing investments and improvements on stops that remain. You can see in the cross-section what I mentioned before about continuous sidewalks, continuous bicycle lanes, travel lanes, and places for people to get on and off the buses. The crosswalks in particular at all these intersections were very, very faded. You'll see when we look at the next picture the kind of typical conditions. And also it's a really wide roadway, so narrowing the roadway, narrowing the lanes, narrowing the places that people need to navigate as they cross the street was a main goal of the project. Next slide. All right, so this is kind of just one little picture of the project at Nicholson Street. You can see in the left the Google view of the project that the crossing, the pavement markings are so faded you can barely even see them. Really, really difficult for a person, an able-bodied person, much less a person with any sort of disabilities, to be able to cross this street safely. They don't have any amenities at all. The ramps are pointing in the wrong direction. Anybody getting on and off the bus here has to navigate a really difficult condition in order to be safe. So the picture on the right is just a little snapshot of the improvements that are coming. So you can see that the crosswalks are going to be improved, the rectangular rapid flash beacon, shorter crossings by getting rid of these kind of slip lanes and access lanes, making high visibility crosswalks in 3 of the 4 approaches of the intersection, really changing it from a place that's almost in no man's land from a pedestrian standpoint, nice to drive on but really hard to walk on, to a place that's easier to walk, easier to navigate, easier to get on and off buses and use this corridor as a sort of complete street. So that's all I have today, and be happy to answer any questions as we move to that part later in the presentation. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Aaron. That was very informative. And we're going to move to our next speaker, which is Ashley Mason. And Ashley is from Richmond at the Greater Richmond Transit Company. And we welcome Ashley.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. As Kim stated, my name is Ashley Mason, and I am the Marketing and PR Specialist at GRTC. On behalf of GRTC, I just want to say thank you to the organizers of this webinar. I'm really pleased to be here today to talk about this project that is near and dear to my heart, GRTC Pulse. Next slide, please. So what is GRTC Pulse? Well, it is a high-quality, high-capacity bus rapid transit system which will travel to destinations in the city of Richmond as well as in Henrico County. The picture right here shows our Pulse vehicle. It is a CNG BRT Plus bus. The bus is a standard CNG bus. Their fuel tanks are located on the top of the bus. Our bike rack holds 3 bikes, and inside, of course, is what the main difference between our current fleet is the fact there's no fare box. Next slide. And why there's no fare box on the bus is because at the station we actually have off-board beer collection. We have ticket vending machines at every station location along the Pulse corridor. Another feature of the Pulse project is the frequency of service. The bus is going to arrive every 2 minutes on peak. That's at 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. The bus will have that rapid, frequent service of every 10 minutes. Off peak, the bus will arrive every 15 minutes. The Pulse route is 7.6 miles in length, and of that 7.6 miles, there is 3.2 miles of dedicated bus-only lanes. The bus will be operating along the median running lane as well as along the curb side of Broad and Main Streets. At 53 intersections along the Pulse corridor, we actually have some technology, and that is our transit signal priority. So on each bus, there's some technology that allows to speak to the lights. So when they're about to enter an intersection that's about to change to yellow, it'll actually stay green longer for the bus to travel through safely. And then at a red light, the bus will get a preemptive start on traffic as well. Also for our project, we have 14 station locations. There's 5 median locations and 9 curbside. In total, we have 26 station platforms. There's 1 station at each terminus point at Woolon and Rapids Landing. And for all the stations in between, there's both an eastbound and westbound platform. Next slide, please. Before I get into more detail of this project, I just want to go over some principles, design principles of this project. And this was created in collaboration with our Policy Advisory Committee, PAC, as well as our Technical Advisory Committee. And this was just our guiding principles that we used in design of the project. So first off, safety and use for all. That includes not only pedestrians, but bicyclists as well as vehicles as well. We want to make sure that the corridor was safe for everyone. North-south connectivity and access. As you'll see later on in this presentation, we've closed up some areas along the corridor just to make sure that it was, once again, safe for all users of the corridor. We still maintain that north and south connectivity as well. Finally, adequate median and lane width. The city of Richmond is actually a historic city, and our travel lanes are quite narrow, especially on Broad and Main streets. So in designing the pulse, we had to make sure that the lanes were wide enough to accommodate the buses. So we made sure that in some parts of the corridor, we had to shave down the median and make sure that the bus had an 11-foot wide median so the bus could operate comfortably down the corridor. Next slide, please. Here is an example, or rather, here are 2 examples of our curb running stations. The picture on the left is actually of our Government Center West station, right in front of our City Hall. As you can see, this is our buses docked right in front of the station platform, and this was during an outreach event that we had about a month ago. The picture on the right actually shows our East Riverfront East station location, and that's the home of our future Stone Brewery Beer Garden, as well as our East Riverfront project that the City of Richmond is doing. These are great opportunities and great locations for our stops. Next slide, please. And here we have our median running station. This is where we're actually going to get more in depth about the pedestrian safety measures we put in place along the corridor. But I just want to point out some design features of the station location. So first off, as I mentioned before, that Richmond is a historic city and we are quite proud of our history. So we want to incorporate that in design of our station. So you see the heavy steel truss as well as the brickwork, and that can be found at our old train shed, which is located at our current Science Museum of Virginia. If you look to the right of that picture, you can see kind of, it almost blends into the background. You can see our totem pole that will actually have the station name on it. And it'll also have a light that will rise to indicate when the bus approaches, and that's for pedestrians as well as users of the pulse. Next slide, please. All right, so this is at Allison as well as our previous slide was located. But in this instance, if this gentleman was crossing the street to access the station, he would be actually accessing our Allison West station location. So I want to point out this picture is actually in front of a Richmond landmark, Lee's Chicken. I don't know if y'all are familiar with that, but we have a love for Lee's Chicken in the city of Richmond. The pedestrian crosswalk is a transverse crosswalk, and as Aaron mentioned in his presentation, our crosswalk is also faded. So that's a real problem. If you also notice behind the gentleman who's crossing the street, you can see that we have our curb ramp right there, and the pedestrian crosswalk is kind of curved to meet that ramp. It's right in front of that brick wall as well as that signage that indicates that that is Lee's Chicken right there. This is at a signalized intersection, by the way. Next slide, please. Now here is pedestrian crosswalk after we completed the station. I am happy to report that you can see we now have a ladder pedestrian crosswalk. The station is actually centered with the station itself. So prior, as we saw on the previous slide, that the curb ramp was actually located towards that brick wall, towards the right over there, as well as that signage. Now is directly in front of Lee's Chicken, so people have direct access to chicken from now on if they're trying to get to and from or across Broad Street. Right here you can see that there's a signal pole. You can see in the background of that picture as well, and they'll have pedestrian push buttons, and we'll see that later on in the slide as well. This is a high visibility area of the corridor, so we want to make sure we have that ladder pedestrian crosswalk as well. Next slide, please. Here is our VCU and VUU station location. So this is in the heart of Virginia Commonwealth University Station, and I must say in this area of the corridor there's a lot of heavy pedestrian traffic. As you can see, I took this picture. We had some people deciding to use the crosswalk and stand on the pedestrian refuge, as well as people who decide to disregard the crosswalk even though they're right next to it. So right here, once again, the crosswalk, the ladder crosswalk, is aligned with the curb ramp right there. And as you can see, we also have the handrails to protect pedestrians from any oncoming traffic as they're boarding the station platform. We have that lady right there who's clearly watching to make sure there's no cars are crossing, and once again, this is at a signalized intersection. All of our median stations are located at signalized intersections because we want to make sure that there is that safe pedestrian crossing where we can monitor and maintain activity throughout the area. Next slide, please. Here's a closer look at that station platform. This is actually at the eastbound one. Here we have, you can see that it's a 6-foot pedestrian refuge. The gentleman right there on the right is standing on that tactile warning strip, as you've seen in our previous slides. That's, of course, to warn people that they're about to enter into oncoming traffic. So just that reminder that they're about to enter into traffic. Also, we have those ballards right there to protect people from vehicular traffic, as well as that median nose right there to protect people as well. We chose this carefully in the design of the post to make sure that, once again, that we try to protect all users of the corridor, including pedestrians as well as bicyclists. And also in this picture, you can see you have a closer look at that handrail that I was talked about in the previous slide leading up to the station platform. Next slide, please. And this picture right here, I mentioned before that pedestrian push button that we had at that intersection of Lee's Chicken. Here is a closer look. This is pretty standard at transit agencies and along city routes, but as you can see, it has that little diagram above the push button where it indicates the little walking figure is of a person that shows that it's safe to walk. The next two of the flashing hand or the countdown warning you that their time is running out. You need to finish crossing the intersection. And finally, you have that city hand to warn you it is not time to cross. Now, these are opportunities. You would push this button when you're standing on the curb side of the road and you're waiting to cross the street to access the median station. However, what if you're actually at the station platform and you need to access the curbside? Say you want to go back to Lee's Chicken after you cross the street. Well, the picture on the right actually shows that median pedestrian platform, but it shows that ballard once again where it has that push button, and that actually signals to the traffic signal light if you were to arrive mid-cycle of the light, and that would send a warning to say it's time to let the rider or the pedestrian cross the street. Next slide, please. Now, despite all the safety measures that I mentioned previously, we know once again that despite these measures that people are still going to cross mid-block. Once again, we're at VCU, VUU station locations, and as you can see, you have 3 young ladies who are crossing the street. The first lady looks like she's about to start a party. The middle girl looks like she's alert of what's going on, and the third girl right there on the right-hand side is a little has reason for concern. It looks like she's not really focused or paying attention to the fact that she is about to step over the curb into oncoming traffic. So in designing the pulse, we knew that things like this, of course, would happen. So we made sure that even in the landscaped area of the platform, that we would have a pedestrian refuge as well. And that is also 6 feet wide to accommodate those people who disregard these safe pedestrian areas that we have created along the corridor for those very reasons. Next slide, please. Here is a part of the corridor which I am very pleased to show you. So prior to the pulse being built, let's look first at the picture on the left. If you look closely, you can see some bicyclists crossing a street. That's actually Monroe. Prior to this project, there is actually a gap in the median right where those bicyclists are riding. So essentially, if you were traveling eastbound Broad Street, and I can tell you from my own personal experience, it has happened countless times, you'll be driving along, listening to your radio, and all of a sudden someone in front of you will slam on their brakes, to try to make that northbound turn into Jackson Ward. That's the neighborhood that's located off the north of Broad Street. It was quite dangerous, I can tell you, and I probably avoided many accidents because of very intersections like that. Because of things like this, the project partners were very clear on making sure that the corridor was safe for all users as one of our guiding principles, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation. So we closed the median. People could no longer turn here. And I would also like to add that I have spoken to businesses that were located on the south side of this very intersection, and there have been at least 2 incidents where cars who have been traveling across this intersection have actually crashed into the storefront. So adding this median has actually made this corridor a lot safer for even people who are working along the corridor as well. But in addition to that safety measure, the median, we actually added this transverse pedestrian crosswalk. Despite what our previous Allison Street Station transverse crosswalk looked like before, these lines are clearly lined, as you can see. Once again, you also have that pedestrian refuge with that tactile strip to warn pedestrians that they're about to enter into oncoming traffic. And once again, we're just really proud to see that, we have made this corridor a lot safer for all users. Next slide. I want to add for this picture right here, I was out taking pictures, that these are not paid people to walk across the crosswalk. But as I have thought earlier and said earlier, if you build it, they will come. So as I was taking pictures, these 2 gentlemen who were at Monroe decided they wanted to cross the street, and despite of crossing mid-block like we saw in the previous slides with the BC students, they actually decided to use the pedestrian crosswalk that we put in place. And it's our hope that as we continue with the Pulse and once we launch this summer, that people will continue to abide these safe pedestrian measures that we've put in place along the corridor. Next slide, please. This is my contact information. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to contact me. Once again, I want to thank everyone for hearing me talk about the Pulse, and I will turn it back over.
All right, thank you, Ashley, and thank you all the speakers. We're at the time of this webinar presentation where we're going to look at your questions, so you have a chance to ask them. We want to ask our operator to provide some instructions on how can participants ask their questions. And can the operator do that?
Yes, my pleasure. If you'd like to ask an audio question, please press *1 on your telephone keypad. That is *1 to ask an audio question. We will pause for just a moment to compile the Q&A roster.
All right, and while we're waiting, what we're going to do, we have a question in the chat box, and the question says, what kind of safeguards are in place for people or drivers maneuvering a roundabout in an inappropriate direction? So if somebody's going in the roundabout the wrong way, what's in place, or what can we do about that as far as safety? Anybody would like to handle that? So, yes.
This is Jay. I had the roundabout, so I guess that question was for me. Well, I mean, we do have some wrong way signage. I don't believe there's much more than that we can do. I know that all of our driveways and along the light rail will encourage drivers to turn right, so they will turn. It'll be a right turn only as they come out of their driveways, so they should not go the wrong way. But then as they come to the intersection itself or the roundabout itself, there will be wrong way signs. But that's the only thing that we can do right now. Now, as far as the pedestrians are equally vulnerable there because they're going to be assuming vehicles should be coming from the left and not from their right. So
I just want to add, do you see that as a problem fairly often? People going the wrong way in the roundabout, or is that usually the way the roundabout set up, it's not much of a problem?
It does happen. Not everyone is familiar with how to navigate a roundabout. Other than education, people getting familiar with an area and doing what they're supposed to be doing, I don't know what can be done. Just education is probably the main thing.
Okay, good. All right, we appreciate the answer. And we have another question in chat box from Carrie. It says, do any agencies listening in have standard pedestrian crossing treatments installed at mid-block transit stops that do not require minimum pedestrian crossing warrants? Anybody? So if you look there, I want to take that question on.
I can chime in a tiny bit on the transit stops issue. Since Metro doesn't own the roadways, we don't have warrants. We depend on our right-of-way owners to deal with those warrants. So if they provide a crossing for us, it's great, but we really have no role in if we get a crossing or not.
Okay, great. And another question for Richmond for you, Ashley. Has Richmond got any feedback on the yellow PED signal button on a yellow bollard from the visually impaired community?
Hello, thank you for the question. No, we do not. We have not received any feedback, but as a matter of fact, I'll be giving a presentation to people with vision impairments this upcoming Monday. So I'll have the opportunity to talk to them about it then. I think it'll be a great asset to have that as well. And I forgot to mention, and please forgive me during my presentation, that also at the signalized intersections where the median stations are located, once the pedestrian button is activated and it's safe to cross, there's actually a little audio box at the top that chirps for people with vision impairment so they know that it's safe to cross the street as well. So that's a neat little pedestrian feature. When I first noticed it, I was like, oh, that's a nice little sound. You know, it was quite charming to hear. Thank you.
All right. So let's go with some of the operating questions. So do we have anybody wanting to ask questions assisted with our operator?
We do have a question from Matt Messina.
Go ahead, Matt.
Hey, this is a question about the roundabout located with the Phoenix Light Rail. Where is that going to be located?
It's actually in Mesa, Arizona, so it's part of our Gilbert Road extension. It's just east of Phoenix. I mean, it depends on where you're from.
So, like, what are the cross streets?
Oh, it's Main and Horn.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, any other questions for the operator?
And again, if you'd like to ask an audio question, press star 1. And there are no further audio questions.
Okay, let's go back and we're going to look in our chat room. And we have one here where traffic engineering requirements to look at 20 crossings per peak period or enhanced crosswalks on major arterial corridors. Does anyone have advice on how to overcome such a mindset when addressing transit access along a 4-lane facility with 24,000, I don't know what that is, ADT and speeds posted at 45 miles per hour?
Average daily traffic.
Oh, it's average daily traffic, ADT. Yeah, well, that's pretty, yeah, a lot of traffic, okay. Anybody?
Ken, this is Ashley. Can you repeat the question again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, let's look at this one. It's in the chat box. It was requirements to look at 20 crossings per peak period for enhanced crosswalks on major arterial corridors. Does anyone have advice to overcome such a mindset when addressing transit access along a 4-lane facility with 25,000 average daily, traffic speeds posted at 45 miles per hour? So it's like a road with a lot of traffic and going very fast.
So, this is Aaron from Metro. If you're able to access the presentation or just Google Metro design and placement of transit stops, the document should come up. there are some really good pages in there that talk about treatments of bus stops and different types of facilities. One thing that I've seen done in some places is essentially bump outs, curb bulb outs that make the curb where the pedestrians go out to the level of the street, and so that the pedestrians can sort of step out further closer to the bus, and then the bus doesn't actually leave the travel lane. The bus stays in the travel lane. That can be one effective measure. There's also some tables in the document that talk about different speeds and how you might be able to deal with different treatments at different sort of average speeds. So I would take a look at that document. You might get some ideas and some inspiration from there.
This is Sarah Joshua. This is a great question, because I think what this question highlights is the disconnect between those who design streets and put the various traffic controls and those who put transit systems in place and force transit riders to cross at unsafe locations. I think the traffic engineering community and whatever the warrants that we have for various crossing treatments have not kept up with the changing landscape in transportation. If you are putting transit anywhere, we need to have safe access to transit riders that are pedestrians. And this criteria like this that are still in place are a disconnect. So I think we need to address that. I think there are advances being made, but we still have a long ways to go. And in my opinion, many places like this, there are many locations like this in our region that we have transit stops right across streets like this with high speeds and high volumes. And I think all the agencies involved in here bear some liability when you are exposing pedestrians to cross at these locations. Thank you.
And so, Ralph, we have another question. It's about that roundabout in Mesa. The question is, will there be Z pedestrian crossings at both ends of the roundabout?
Yes, both east and west. The north and south side will be a traditional crossing of a roundabout.
And what's the planned timeline for that roundabout to be built?
It should be open in 13 months.
Great. Thank you. And we have another question, I think, for Aaron that says, what is the ADT and posted speed for Ager Road? Were 10-foot travel lanes considered in order to provide a marked buffer between the bike lane and adjacent travel lane in each direction?
So ADT, I'm not entirely sure. I think it's in the maybe like 15,000, something like that. I'd have to look that number up. The 10-foot lanes are a problem for us. Metro requires anywhere that we operate that we have an 11-foot lane. And that's because the bus itself, when you count the mirrors, is wider than 10 feet. So in order to operate that bus safely without its mirrors getting knocked off by trucks and roadside obstructions that might come up, we require an 11-foot lane. So if they would have given us a 10-foot lane, we would have had to remove service from the street. So that's usually not the way things go. Usually we get an 11-foot lane, at least on the curbside lane where we're operating the bus.
All right. And then we have another question I'm going to add in here. Are audible pedestrian signals required? Anyone?
We do. And Valley Metro always requires them at our crossings.
Others? What's your local requirement for audible pedestrian signals?
This is Ashley from GRTC. I know that in some portions of Broad Street there are those audible pedestrian crossings. However, I have noticed that in some there are not along the corridor.
Yeah, and in general, if you do include them, then there's the ADA requirements to put them in, and you should really look at different intersections in your design and look at where they make most sense for safety of people crossing. So keep all that in mind. All right, got another question for you, Ashley. In Richmond, how are bike lanes being treated at bus stops?
That is a great question, and unfortunately, this has been an ongoing concern for bicycle advocates throughout the city of Richmond, because unfortunately we do not have many bike lanes. Currently along Broad Street we share the road with bicyclists, and even during the construction of the poles we've been noticing that our bicyclists have been riding down the median running lane, which is really unsafe because it was still an active construction zone. So I know GRTC is working in collaboration with our bike advocates throughout the city, but right now we don't have any, I don't have a real answer for you.
So in Richmond, I'm just trying to think, I've been in there, there's not many bike lanes at all. There's some bike trails, but not bike lanes actually on the roadway. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. We just recently, in the last 2 years, I would say, Floyd Avenue, which also travels through Virginia, VCU, they made that a bicycle roadway. So the bikes, they have complete dominance over the road in that area. And we've also incorporated roundabouts in that area as well to slow down the vehicular traffic. And I think now, when you travel down Floyd, you see less vehicles on there because they're trying to avoid getting stuck behind a bicyclist and trying to, navigate those roundabouts.
Yeah, one thing we've seen in the Washington region is lots and lots of bike lanes on the curbside lane. Typically, the buses will just cross over the bike lane. The drivers are trained to watch out to see if anybody is in that lane before they cross, but they're just crossing over it, and in a lot of cases they have the bus sitting in the bike lane while they're serving customers. It's not an ideal situation, but in a limited right-of-way when the bus has to get to the curb, often that's the only kind of option that we have. You can see in the Ager Road project, one treatment that we've done is sort of, instead of providing a solid line along the bike lane where buses are going to be crossing, they sort of did a staccato pattern to warn the bicyclist that, hey, there might be a vehicle or bus coming from your left, and it's a way for the driver of the bus to also know that that's a place that you can cross into the bike lane. So it kind of gives both of them a warning that that's a place where there might be some crossing of different traffic, and it can help somewhat with safety. The District of Columbia has used that treatment quite a bit.
Okay, that's really interesting. Got another question. Says in Kalamazoo, we ask for safe crossings mid-block and are told that the requirements say they can't be installed. As a transit operation, we can't put stops at corners all the time, so how is this resolved mid-block? Especially when there can't be any receivers or curve cuts for wheelchairs. So I got a response to that. So this is mid-block crossings.
Yeah, that's one of our largest sort of requests is how can I get across the street at a mid-block. It's a very, very difficult problem, and one that's not easily solved. We don't like there to be we don't like to encourage people to cross at a mid-block location either, but oftentimes the only place that we can place the stop is in a mid-block location, or maybe the intersections are so far apart that in order to serve, an office building or a community, that you have to put something in that's not, away from an intersection, several hundred feet away. It might be 1,000 feet or 1,500 feet between those stops, and giving a stop in the middle at least allows some access to those to the developments on either side. So yeah, it's a difficult problem. We don't require there to be a crossing at the pair of bus stops. Sometimes people are just sort of left to either cross illegally or walk up to the nearest intersection.
Okay, so there's no real easy answer on that, and then although it probably depends on a lot of local factors around traffic, speed, and flow, whatever. So, and the follow-up to that, yes, go ahead.
I'd like to comment on that. I think this idea that we shouldn't interrupt traffic flow in mid-block locations to allow pedestrian safe access, I think that's an idea that we need to kind of question. Yes, it will interrupt traffic flow, but putting a stoplight in the middle to accommodate pedestrians, if you look at benefit-cost ratio of the cost of putting a traffic signal in with a pedestrian actuation, I think you'll find that it has a great benefit-cost ratio for saving lives over the number of years that the life cycle of the traffic light. So I think this idea that we shouldn't interrupt traffic, in fact, we can put a mid-block signal without interrupting traffic flow if we can synchronize that signal, time it to work according to the adjacent signals. It can be easily done. And the cost of a traffic signal is anywhere, in mid-block signal is about $200,000, and what's the cost of a life? So I think this notion of interrupting traffic is an old idea that we shouldn't interrupt traffic. We should interrupt traffic and provide safe access. And putting a hawk signal or a pedestrian push-button signal is, I think, the safest way to provide that access. There are other treatments that we looked at and we've gone over today. But I think the safest crossing at a high-speed location where you have high-speed traffic is a traffic signal or a hawk signal. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Surat. Good points for people to consider. Another question we have is a participant would like to see how to include a bus stop along dedicated bus lanes. How do we place a stop where riders would step into a bike lane? And I think this is an issue we have around in the Washington area.
So I'm not sure if I'm following the question.
Okay, yeah. So you got a bus stop that's along the bike lane. So you have the bike lane right with the bus stop. And so how do you want to place the stop right on that bus lane? And the issue would be where riders might step into the bike lane itself.
Yeah, I've seen things sort of done in two ways. One is the bus would be in the travel lane and then literally cross over the bicycle lane to get to the curb. It's not the best thing for the bicyclists because they're going to have to swing around the bus if the bus is stopped there. But it's a way for sort of both of those things to mix together, and that was the kind of staccato traffic line paint treatment that I talked about earlier to kind of warn people. There's other ways of sort of organizing the street so that the bike lane might be on the other side of the street or in the median. That reduces the conflicts totally, but oftentimes that's harder to implement in terms of a safe bicycle lane, to have it be in the median with the left turns and all the other things that go on in the sort of middle of the street. So most of the time the bus just goes over to the side just like they would cross a lane of travel. We would consider the bicycle lane to just be another lane of travel that we cross over to get to the curb.
All right, thank you, Aaron. I'll have a question. This one writes, as a blind transit advocate, I wonder how often planners consider audio levels when designing crossings. So I think it's for the audible signal. And if anybody, when you put in your audible signals at your crossings, how do you determine what the volume of that signal should be, or is there any changing to the audible level depending on ambient noise?
This is Jay from Phoenix again. That's my understanding of how the devices that we use respond. It's based on the ambient, but I would have to go research the manufacturers to be sure, but that's my understanding.
So in general, some signals have a set volume, but the signals you're using, and there are many signals out there that will adjust to the ambient noise. The more noise you have, the louder the signal will be. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Great. All right, so let's see. I'm going to look for another question. There's one that says, for those who have transit signals, can you talk about their effectiveness and types of locations where you are using them? So transit signals, and I would think this be more in the BRT situation?
Or LRT. Well, LRT, we have transit signals that guide our trains, vertical bars and horizontal bars. So we guide the vehicle through the intersection at the 200-ish intersections that we have. So yeah, they work very well.
So, and people seem to respond to them well. Okay.
Well, no, people don't need to. No, the operators are the ones who respond.
Yeah, the operators. I'm talking about also sometimes there are people, there's signals for transit that interface with pedestrians to let them know, trains are coming and, kind of warnings for trains. So, in your light rail. All right, are we getting down to the last, I think we're done?
Yes, I think we are. And with that, it looks like we're about out of time. We want to thank all of our presenters today from Phoenix, the Washington region, and Richmond. Thank you as well to Carol from Tool Design Group and Becky Crow from FHWA for helping us coordinate this webinar. And we will let you know that the webinar has been recorded, and we will upload it to the NADTC website early next week, and you'll be able to find it. Our website address is www.nadtc.org. Please visit the website and FHWA website for additional pedestrian resources. Thanks again to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week.